folks, let's try this again. I have no idea what went wrong with the audio on the past video. I've done a test today to see if this will work. Hopefully it'll work out, so bear with me through these technological issues that I'm having today. Okay, so our first topic that we'll be dealing with this week is gender, sex, and sexuality. And my goal here is just to provide some different definitions that will allow us to examine this topic from an anthropological perspective. And then it's going to build into the subsequent discussion we'll have on Friday relating to kinship and marriage. So just a quick note that I also teach a course called Anthropology 110, Gender, Age, and Culture, where we get into this topic of gender and sex and sexuality at much more length. So this is just what we'll cover in this course is a brief window into how anthropologists approach these topics. And I'll just note, of course, that I'm not the only person who teaches this class, but it's one that's regularly in my teaching rotation. And you'll see a lot of the videos and lectures for this course are posted on my YouTube channel as well. So if you'd like to see some of the things that we cover in that class and get a bit more insight into it, please feel free to examine those. So the most important topic or concepts that I want to clarify for you in relation to this topic is that anthropologically, we make a distinction between sex and gender. Now note, what we're going to talk about on Wednesday is both of these are subject to cultural construction. So what that means is that different cultures approach an understanding of what sex is and what gender is differently. So what I'm presenting to you is how anthropologists approach and define these topics. So we'll start by looking at sex, and then we'll get into discussing gender, and then gender is actually going to pop up a lot throughout the rest of the term in relation to some of our other topics. And we've already had some discussion on gender when we talked about genital modification, for example. So we'll keep looking at these further on. So that's why it's important, or I thought it was important at this point in the term, to go over these topics. So let's begin then with sex being biological sex. So what do we mean by biological sex? Well, the observable physical differences that we as a species have as a result of being a sexually reproduction or a species that reproduces through sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction, right? So the attributes then that we use to assign or to determine an individual's sex relates to the various roles that we play and functions that our bodies have as relates to reproduction. Gender, on the other hand, is the way that we understand from a cultural perspective the various attributes of these sexes, how we evaluate and perceive and expect members of these sexes to behave. So it includes things like gender roles, gender identity, gender expression, and I have some definitions for this coming up in the notes here. It's also the ways that we expect people to think and feel as members of these sexes as well. So hopefully what this captures here again is that gender is heavily influenced by culture. However, while we think of sex as being biological, what I want to talk about and the position I want to take is that sex is also shaped by our culture as well. Oops, sorry, too far. Okay. So when we take a biological perspective then, well, what attributes do we then use to assign sex to an individual? And it's based on three primary factors: genitalia, or the external presentation of the organs that are used in sexual reproduction. We have gonads, and of course, I mentioned that it's part of sexual reproduction, but there's also other reasons why the genitalia present that they in the forms that they do. They're also linked with sexual pleasure as well. So I don't want to undervalue that and just say, well, this is only relates to sexual reproduction. It actually connects with our topic of sexuality as well. And we'll talk about this a bit more. But so we have genitalia, we have gonads, or the internal organs that produce the gametes or the sex cells. And then we have chromosome patterns. And one of the things that I want to talk a little bit about is about how we have these kind of attributes, these biological traits that individuals have. And we also then have ideas of what these traits are and how they present themselves in sexed individuals. key thing to note is that the reason why we focus on these traits again is because of sexual reproduction, but also because of sexual dimorphism, that we do have, as a result of how we reproduce, differences in the expression of traits between males and females of our species. However, considering that we are attempting to take a biological perspective here, we also have to acknowledge that biology has demonstrated that we do have in human, because we are a species that has what's called clinal variation. We'll talk about this more subsequently in a couple of weeks when we look at modern human variation, when we look at the construction of race, is that we also have intersex individuals. So individuals who are born with a combination, or what we might consider to be a combination of both male and female biological traits, so genitalia, gonads, and chromosomes. And again, this can look and be patterned in a number of different ways with intersexed individuals, right? So there's no one way of being intersexed. And so I've posted a couple of links about this, about how increased awareness, for example, of intersex variation has led to many states acknowledging and formally recognizing intersexed as a sex category. And so there's an older article here talking about how the United States now has, a few states in the United States has intersex birth certificates. Here in Canada, you can declare your sex as X. Which includes intersex, but also reflects how one of the issues we have as anthropologists in terms of studying sex and gender is that these terms are used interchangeably in social contexts and by the media as well. So it's really important as anthropologists that we're very clear about what term we're using and why we're using it and how we're defining it. So part of some of the challenges that we have around understanding sex from even a biological perspective is that it's much more complicated than simply just looking at, well, what traits do you have? So what is the phenotypic expression of the chromosomal patterns or the genotype that you have? And so I'm going to jump forward here a bit and just show you, is because when we're looking at how sex plays out in individuals, there's a number of other factors that shape the expression of these sex-linked attributes and traits in humans, right? That our chromosomes only play one role in determining or influencing what sex we have, that there are other genes that play a role in this. And actually, there's been research showing that actually only some of the sex-linked chromosomes are associated with the kind of classic sex chromosomes that we think of, like so X and Y chromosomes. That hormones, of course, play a critical role in communicating and signaling the development of secondary sexual characteristics. So these are characteristics that occur in our bodies as a result of puberty. But of course, how those hormones play out in our bodies is shaped by not only our chromosomes, but also the gonads that are present in our system and the interaction with, again, our larger endocrine system as well. And of course, then our external and internal sex organs play a role. And of course, even our external genitalia, for example, can have a variety of expressions in terms of what they look like, right? So there's no kind of standard set pattern of this is what a penis looks like, or this is what labia look like, or a clitoris looks like, for example. We can have quite a bit of variation in what this anatomy looks like, right? So even from a biological perspective, the thing is that I want to communicate, the kind of key message here around sex is that it's complicated, right? That it's not as simple as saying, if you have these parts, then your sex is this. Indeed, many individuals may not even be aware of being intersexed, or that there's quote unquote a problem in terms of the expression of these traits. Until puberty hits, or until actually much later when you're attempting to reproduce, when you're seeking to understand why are you unable to conceive. And so some of the reasons why humans are infertile might link to chromosomal variations that are present. And again, unless you're testing for that, you may not know what your chromosomes are, right? And then same thing with your internal gonads. You may not be aware of what you have until puberty sets, or there's the onset of puberty, or until puberty is delayed, or there's other issues related to that. So the key here is to think that while we might think that, oh, sex is easy to identify and therefore to assign to individuals, it's simply not that case. And so keeping all of these things in mind, what I wanted to present was an aspect of biological anthropology which relates to sex estimation. And this is because in popular culture and in popular media, we often see this in crime serials or shows like Bones, where human skeletal remains are found and they're able to determine the sex of that individual. And really, when in biological anthropology, we don't think of it as determination, but rather sex estimation, that knowing how modern human variation presents itself on the perspective of sex, we have been able to identify that there are specific traits that present themselves in our skeleton that may assist us in identifying or estimating the sex of individuals. But even doing so, we recognize, again, with this understanding of clinal variation, we can talk more about this in class on Wednesday, is that because we're all one species, and because of clinal variation means that many of us might have a combination of traits or traits that kind of trend in one direction or another. And when we look at the sum of these traits in an individual, especially when we just have their skeleton, when we don't have the benefit necessarily of seeing genitalia, of seeing the gonads, of being able to determine what chromosomes are present, we again are kind of coming up with best guesses of what the sex of this individual might be. And that results then in us having what we call the 5 skeletal sexes, which states that we might have individuals who the sum of their traits suggests they are female, or they might have the majority of their traits presenting as female, but they might have other traits that present as male, therefore are probable female. We might have individuals where it's simply difficult to determine or establish what sex they are, and as such we may say that it's ambiguous. And then of course we can have probable male and male as well. And there's an excellent video that I've posted here using, where a colleague of mine, a biological anthropologist, explains how we can do sex estimation, but I thought I would highlight in this video a couple of key traits. Now note that because we tend to focus on traits that develop after the onset of puberty or secondary sexual characteristics, we tend to focus on the pelvis, but we can use things like the skull. So again, because humans are sexually dimorphic, meaning that on average males are about 10% larger than females when we look at human populations as a whole, this means that there are some traits and attributes in our skull that tend to present as larger in biological males than in females. An example of this is the mastoid process. It's this little triangular piece of bone that you can feel just kind of directly behind your ear canal there. And in females, it tends to be very small and less pronounced. Males, it tends to be much more pronounced. We have the nuchal crest, which is kind of a bony ridge along the back of the skull. Again, tends to be more pronounced in males, less pronounced, more smooth in females. However, again, because we're humans, because all humans are capable of expressing traits in these different kinds of ways, I, for example, have a very nuchal crest, so much so that we might score it as a 4 or a 5. However, my mastoid process is very small. I might score it as a 1 or 3. So on the basis of these two traits alone, where I have 1 representing a female, or 2 a probable female, or 4 representing a male, or probable male, or 5, right, a male, what that means is that my sex on the basis of those 2 traits on my skull alone might be estimated to be that as, well, then ambiguous, right? Either or. Note, we wouldn't just use 2 traits, we use multiple traits in this assessment. Again, the skull, because it isn't linked with reproduction, isn't as accurate. Again, we've determined what traits are useful by looking at skeletons of known populations where we know what the sex of those individuals are. What is really useful is the pelvis, and because we see a number of alterations in the pelvis as relates to human reproduction, specifically labor and delivery of the fetus. So female pelvises tend to be much more wider, broader, have a larger pelvic inlet or opening that allows for the safe delivery of that fetal skull through the vaginal canal, right, during delivery, during labor and delivery, whereas males tends to be a lot more narrower. And so then we have other traits such as the greater sciatic notch that again contribute to this larger pelvic opening and a larger pelvis overall in females versus and in males. So again, I just wanted to illustrate that this is how it operates, and we can talk about this a little bit more. What we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about on Wednesday is what I'm not going to talk too much about in this video is that gender is a cultural construct, because we need to learn how to behave as members of a gender, that we are assigned a gender often at birth. It's often linked with our sex. But again, how different cultures construct genders varies cross-culturally, right? So gender is a cross-cultural universal. All societies have an understanding of gender, but how that gender is defined and the different kinds of genders that are defined vary cross-culturally. And so one of the things I want to look at on Wednesday is challenging, first and foremost, the very kind of Western perspective that there is what we call kind of cisnormativity or heteronormativity, that there's two genders and two sexes, and as such, attraction is only between those two genders, right? So male and female. But I've given you some examples here, and your textbook talks about them, that there are other societies, other cultures that recognize a vast greater amount or variety of gender and gender expression. And so we're going to look at Two-Spirit people in class on Wednesday, and then we'll also talk about an example from the Indian subcontinent and South Asia more broadly, a number of different terminology, but is the kind of term that is used most commonly is that of hijra. So we'll talk about hijra as well. The reason why we're going to be talking about this relates to something we talked about last week, which is about political and social organization and power. And so I want to discuss with you folks gender inequality and gender equality, and how different societies construct gender reflects different values around the different roles that people perform in society and how that contributes to inequality. We can talk a little bit about intersectionality and how feminism is a contemporary intersectional feminism is a complementary framework and is complementary to the anthropological perspective when we examine sex and gender and sexuality. And then I've also given some definition on sexuality, because of course how we construct sex and gender also shapes our understanding of sexuality. And so I'd like to discuss this, which is not only guest definition, but this will then lead into our discussion on Friday, looking at the construction of kin and marriage, because we have a lot of ideas as well from a cultural perspective on what practices are normal or natural, what is not seen as natural, what is seen as deviant, quote unquote deviant, or inappropriate, or more appropriately from an anthropological terminology perspective, what is taboo. So we're going to talk about how we determine what appropriate sexual partners are, because that then shapes how families are reproduced, right? How children are produced. We'll talk a little bit about when and where sexual relations are and are not appropriate. And so the point of all of this is to illustrate that while we might have a lot of ideas about, again, what is quote unquote natural when it comes to sex and sexuality, that there's also, while there is a strong biological component, it's also shaped very heavily by our culture, that we have to learn these ideas. And as such, our own understandings and our own experiences then can be malleable. And so there's been a lot of research coming out of not just anthropology, but psychology, sociology, and biology showing that sexuality is something that can change over an individual's lifetime. And part of that is because as we learn more about sexuality within our own culture, and also how other cultures approach sexuality, it may shape our own perspectives of self. So a lot to discuss this week. I'm interested to see what you folks have to say on this topic. And then again on Friday, we'll explore this a little bit further when we look at marriage and the construction of kin and kinship. We're going to link in again politics and political organization. And then when we talk about marriage, we'll link back into last week's topic of economic organization as well. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you on Wednesday.